After landing there the first day, we made the initial landing, and we were very successful in getting ashore. The Japanese were in their holes, and they didn't come out soon enough. If they'd have come out just a few seconds sooner, they would have been able to really take care of us. But they didn't get out soon enough. And as a result, we were able to get in and do business. And so, we finally got that original group of pillboxes that were blocking us from going to the airport. We got them knocked out. And then the episode we had with the foxhole at the big tree where the sniper was up the tree, we got him knocked out, and the major blocking of us going to the airport was over. And then my company was permitted to go back and rest for a while, and we went back, and it was getting dark then, and we moved back to the coconut trees that were behind the line, and that's where we spent the night. And we were doing very well. We thought we had everything under control, and we were laying there resting, and somebody finally got a hold of my leg and shook it and said, "Get up from there. The Japanese have broke through." And so, anyway, we got to go up and fill up the hole. And so, we jumped up, and so we began to set up a line, and we headed for the front line, where the front line was at that time. And it was back of us. And where they had broke through. And we started up that toward the line, and I will never forget it. One fella was scared so bad, he fell over into a hole of water, and he was dead time he hit that water. He had a heart attack. And he was just plain scared to death. But I don't know what happened from then on with him. But as we started back toward that line to fill up where the Japs were coming through, we met a lot of boys that were coming back from up there, and every one of them was crying and carrying on, and he saying, "You can't hold them, there's too many of them." And of course that was kind of nerve-breaking, but and we were to shoot on every other step when we were going up to that line. Well, by the time we got to that line, it was all over. I never saw such a firepower in my life. We had 2 machine guns, we had several BARs, and all of them things just fire about this high off the ground, and we were shooting every time the left foot hit the ground. And so, just a solid mass of fire. And we got up to the line, and when we got there, there wasn't no Japs coming through. And that was the worst firepower I ever saw. But it did do the job. We got them stopped, and we set up there, and we set up a permanent line there, and all of us had several weapons. My buddy Ripstock and I, we had an arsenal. We had our M1s, we had pistols, we had a knee mortar, and we had machine guns, one on each end, and we were in business. And we had them all loaded and lay inside of our hose, and we were ready for business. And so that's the end of that story.
Okay, that's good.
The artillery, 3rd Battalion, 11th Marines, was shelling the Japanese, and they were shelling them pretty heavy. But anyway, they had to have somebody to go out front to make sure the Japanese didn't slip up and blow up the artillery. And so I, along with 2 other fellows, were chosen to go out. And we got in front about 100 yards, and maybe not quite that far, and that artillery was really fired. And it was one shell right after another, and a tremendous barrage was laid down. And every time when those shells would go off, we were out laying on the ground right in front of the shells, guns, and when those shells would go off, we were pounded back in the back onto the ground. And we stayed there all day long, and them guns firing away. And they didn't fire just a few shells. It was all day long, the whole battery. And I have one little reminder of it on my head here. That knot that came up that day on my forehead, and has been there ever since. And no doctor would ever do nothing about it. He'd just look at it and say, well, it's probably a little piece of shrapnel, or it could be a fatty tumor, but they wouldn't none of them touch it. And so it's still there. I don't know what it is, but I know one thing. I had the worst headache that night I ever had in my life. Hill 660 was that high, 660 feet high. And it was quite obvious. It was right on near the beach, and 660 stood out. It was above everything. And all of us could see it. And one day we were told we were going to assault it, and we were going to move up. And moving up on Cape Gloucester was kind of tough. We had to move through the mud. We lay in it all night, and then we'd get up and we'd walk in it all day. And we'd got up to the edge of Hill 660. And we were lined up, the scouts in front, and then the rest of the body came behind. And I saw one general there that was in charge of the operation, and he says, there's nothing up there on that hill. He says, we bummed it with 2,000 pounders. Well, I listened to him like I did some of them other people that told me stories. And I didn't believe it. I figured there was Japanese up there on that hill. Well, I went walking up that hill, and I got within about 20 feet of the top of the hill where the Japanese were set up. And I saw this gun and it was a 60 millimeter gun, and it was on a swivel, and he was turning it around, and I was coming up to it from the east, I believe. And when I saw that gun and him aiming it, getting it aimed right at me and the column that was behind me, I yelled the loudest I ever yelled in my life, and they tell me that I was heard back at the battalion headquarters. But anyway, if I hadn't yelled, my whole outfit would have been slaughtered. But we got out of it. We had only, I believe it was 3 guys that was hit that day. 1 killed and 2 more wounded. 1 boy hit in the butt, and he got out safe other than that. But I came off that hill running just as hard as I could, straight down the hill. And I didn't get hit. But I was lucky, because I was right up there under the gun. And that gun, when it would shoot, the bullets would hit a bush, and then it'd explode. And it was that type of gun.
Was that where you beat the world record running?
No, that won't won the record. But anyway, I got off that hill and got the whole company out, really. And so that day, that ended the fight that day. So the next day, they decided we'd go around the hill and come up from behind. And that's what we did. And I won't never forget my captain when he told me. I thought he was crazy, but he was the captain. And he says, I want you to get in front of that tank and lead the tanks around the hill. And I said, how far? He says, about 15 or 20 feet. And you 15 or 20 feet, and that tank goes off, you're going to get flattened. And anyway, I went further than that. I went much further than that. But I did lead the tank around the hill, and we get around on the back side, and there was a Japanese sitting in a hole over there, and he was the yo-yo that gave the order up the hill. He was sitting there, up the hill. And I don't know why nobody shot him, but they didn't. But anyway, all the privates went up the hill, and got up there, and there was no officers up there on the hill. No non-com. And that's what happened. They can't say they were up there because they weren't. But later on they came up. But when they first got up there, all that was on that hill was privates. I've got a copy of the officers turned it in to Washington. But and that day, after we all got up there, I walked around the daggone hill, and I knew we had it, and we got orders to fall back to the headquarters. And I said, why? We've got the hill. And he said, well, if you got it, set up a perimeter and hold it. And so we set up a perimeter and began to set up a defense. And That's where the fight started for Hill 660. And it was rather amusing. That night there were several Japs killed. Those fellows that went up that hill, they went up there for bear, but they killed a lot of Japanese. And they were laying all over the hill, and all of us just walking around up there on it. And anyway, that's the night that I got in a fight, with a hand-to-hand fight with the Japanese on Hill 660. Hill 660 was one of the tougher engagements that we had on Cape Gloucester. We were, after taking the hill, there were Japanese all over the hill, dead, we thought. But that night, my buddy and I, Rebstock, we were sitting there and we were having a good time just talking to one another. And I looked up there and I thought I saw this Japanese laying up there, and I thought I saw him move. So I stood up to investigate. And about the time I stood up, he stood up. And I found out that he wasn't dead. And so when he stood up, he started running just as straight as he could run toward me. And so he got within just a few feet of me, and I saw him go into crouch, and I knew what he was fixing to do. The Japanese were good at that judo stuff, and he was trying to dive between my legs. Well, when he got to me, he made his dive all right, but when he got to me, I sidestepped him. I turned sideways, and he come by me, and when he did, I popped him in the head with my Tommy gun that I was carrying at that time. And if he'd have been a bull yearling, he would have died right there because I hit him mighty hard. But it didn't hurt that booger. He jumped up from there, and before I could get my thoughts together, he had a hold of me, and he threw me over his head. And they were good at that. Well, I didn't have a counter for that, but he threw me over his head, and anyway, before I could get up, he was trying to throw me over his head again. And so, best I recall, I believe I went over his head twice, and that time I got hurt, and I just made up my mind not to try to do anything about it. And instead of trying to do something about it, I lay still, and the Japanese then, this same fella, he made a dive at me, and when he got to me, I had my Tommy laying across my chest like this, and I shoved it up, and I caught him in the mouth. And that kind of leveled off things for a while. And anyway, Rebstock was up further up the hill at that time, and he was a real buddy. He decided he was going to come down and help me out. Well, we had fought quite a while there, and I looked up and I saw every one of my people around the hill with their rifles aimed at me. and I said, "Don't shoot." And the old Jap says, turned around and said, "Don't shoot." And so, well, we had a right good little fight, and he got his elbow down, and he was coming down in my mouth, and he was pounding away. That's why I don't have any upper teeth now. He pounded away a while. And anyway, he made one mistake. He finally got that elbow down, and he began to rub it in my face. And when he did, I opened my mouth, and I got me a mouthful, the back of his arm. And I locked in. And I bit as hard as I could. And I would not let loose. He tried to shake me off, but he couldn't shake me off. And I kept biting him. And he was telling everybody on that end of the island, there's a bad man a hold of me. And so, when he finally got loose, a couple of minutes later, he took off to run toward his line, and his group was down at the bottom of the hill. I don't know whether he made it or not, because I grabbed my clip and shoved it in my tummy, and I aimed it at him, and I shot 2 clips and 2 bullets at him. They were pretty well aimed, but I don't know whether I hit him or not. But I do know the Japs got him.
What did Rebstock have to do with this fight?
Oh, Rebstock got down there to where we were, and he came down and didn't even bring his rifle. He was upset because I was in a fight. And so he came down, and he got to where we were, and I had a hold of the Japanese, and I was holding him, and and Rebstock hauled off and kicked him in the mouth, in the face, with his boots on. He had a heavy set of boots on, and he struck him in the face. And that's how the Jap how we got separated. He knocked him off. After we got up on that hill, went around the hill, 660, and there was that boom that the general told me about the first day. I saw where it landed, and it knocked a huge hole. And the Japanese knew about that hole. Well, we set up around that hole on the top side. And the Japanese come up that hill the next morning, and they were determined to take that hill again. And every one of them made a dive for that bomb crater. And it was a huge hole, but that was their Waterloo. They should never have gone in it, because we had 2 machine guns trained on a log laying across the top side of it, and those 2 machine guns were trained on that log to tit-tat-toe. And everybody that was in the hole couldn't get out. And those rifles, machine guns, kept firing, and all the rest of us, and a lot of us were sitting there lobbing grenades over in the hole. And so a whole company went up there, and they were chopped to pieces. I think it was the worst sight I think I ever saw. All of them, they couldn't get out. They were chopped up. A leg here and an arm there, and so on. Head there, and it was terrible. but they didn't get out, and that was the end of that.
Britain.
On these hills, when we got there, it was hot. But when we got up on those mountains, with the wind blowing up all around it, it was cold. And Hill 660 was no different. It was just like a refrigerator. And we got cold. But with the air coming up all around it, we got extremely cold. And it liked to have been our Waterloo. But we did get out of it.
Okay.
We were on Cape Gloucester 26 days in the mud. And it was mud all the way around Hill 660. And everywhere we went, it was mud. And that's where we slept. And
Did it rain much?
it rained every day we were there. It was rain, more mud, and rain. Anyway, after Hill 660, we broke through, and I have one other little story. Colonel Puller went through, and he got a bunch of men. He just picked them out and said, "You fall in line and go with me." And they went. And they were chasing the Japs. The Japs were trying to retreat back toward Revolt. And anyway, Colonel Puller got these men, and they went up there, and they really worked them over. But my group moved up into the hills, and we were up there, and this is rather interesting. We ran into some mountain streams up there, and anyway, some of the boys wanted to go fishing. I said, "Well, I'll tell you how we can get them fish." And they said, "How?" I said, "Well, a couple of us go up the stream, and we'll drop a grenade in it. And the grenade will kill the fish, but you got to be down here to catch the fish." And so everybody was willing to try. Well, we had been told to keep quiet. Well, when you drop grenades, that draws attention. But anyway, a couple fellows went up the stream, pulled a pin out of the grenade, and dropped them into the stream, and then took cover themselves. And sure enough, the fish come out of there dead. They were floating down the stream, and we had fish. And then in this position, the Army was going, or some airplanes was going to bring us food. We were up there very high up in the mountains, and they were going to drop food to us. And the Japanese wanted the food too. And so we set up pickets around the area, and these Japanese tried to rush us, but it didn't do no good because we were pretty good at setting up defense. And finally here these airplanes come over, and they begin to drop boxes of food down to us. And so we had food. And that was one of the most interesting things that happened to us on Cape Gloucester. But that whole island, the taking of Cape Gloucester, was known as one of the greatest things that MacArthur was in charge of. He that was considered one of his best deals. And we cut him off from New Guinea, and he was able to move back on up toward the Philippines. But it was carried out fairly well. They went down, they finally got to that airport, and they took that airport in just a few minutes. It didn't take long. Captain Crow was shot on Cape Gloucester. It was after Hill 660. And anyway, we were set up there on the line, and the colonel asked that all the officers meet out in front of the line where he was. And I thought that was a stupid place to meet, because it was no man's land right between us, the enemy and ourselves. And so they met there, and Captain Crow was shot at. And the thing that I remember about that mostly was just before he went out there, I said to him, "Captain, you're going to get them damn bars shot off." And he went out there, and be damned if he didn't get them shot. One bullet went here and one here, and he was crippled the rest of his life. He was, to me, he was a fine person. I thought he was one of the better officers that I had. While we were there,
On New Britain.
for some reason or another, somebody approached me and said, did I want to volunteer to go to Riball? Anyway, two of us decided to go. And we were getting ready to go, and we were going up to Riball and report back to our base what we saw and so on.
How would you report?
Shortwave radio. We had a shortwave radio. We were going up. And anyway, I'm glad somebody had the sense enough to call it off, even though we didn't have no sense. So they called it off, and in the morning right after this, there was 400 and some planes went in the air, and they were going to Riball, and that's the reason they called it off. They decided that was the best way to go. I believe it was 400 and some planes. That was the most planes I ever saw in the air at one time. And they went up, and after they went that day, we never heard any more. We didn't have any more trouble out of the Japanese from Riball.
Okay.
Right after we got to Cape Gloucester, soon after, there was a supply house down there right on the beach. And it was loaded with peppermint candy, fish heads, and fish heads. The fish heads were packed in cans. I believe it was 2 fish heads to the can. And the peppermint candy was just like our peppermint candy, except they didn't put sugar in it. And I don't know why the Japanese didn't use sugar in it, but it wasn't good. But it did have peppermint in it. And so, somehow or another, our crowd managed to get that warehouse on fire. And they burned it to the ground. but it still had a lot of peppermint candy in it and fish heads.
Where did you pick up the Japanese cigarettes from?
Oh, and that's right, there was a bunch of Japanese cigarettes there. And that's where around this warehouse, they had, every tree about it had a poster on it. And it was to demoralizing as it could be. It was a picture of a Japanese, a native person chasing one of the American girls, and this was a propaganda. And anyway, these posters were sticking on all the trees. And I had a bunch of them at one time, and I sold them to some of the other fellows or give them to them. But they were trash, propaganda sheets, and the Japanese had them in the woods there, posted on trees.
Pornography.
Pornography.
Okay.
We kept after the Japanese. We go out day in and day out, and one day we were lining up on the line, and all of a sudden we were getting ready to move out, and I was a scout right on. I was in scouts right on, and while I was standing there, some Japanese had slipped up to the line and fired a Nemo. And we were getting ready to move out on a blitz, and I said to turn around, and I said, "Hey, what in the hell are you shooting at?" And it was the Japanese. I didn't have to ask no more. I turned around, and I saw the fellows hitting the line behind us. And anyway, they were hitting their holes, and another knee mortar fired, and I saw where it hit. And anyway, we managed to take care of that. But when we got on New Britain, it was a different ball game. They were going to transfer one of us, and they decided they wanted to keep me, and they transferred Smalley. And Smalley I didn't know where he was transferred to. They didn't tell me that. But we get on New Britain, and here Smalley shows up. This Japanese slipped up on me when I was lining up out to move out, and this officer was there with his pistol, and he was pulling it down like this, and he was fixing to shoot, and all of a sudden I heard an M1 go off, and that was Smalley, and he shot this officer who was fixing to shoot me, and if he'd just been a second or two later, he would have been successful. But Smalley run up there then, and he says, "I want that pistol." Well, I'll tell you, I didn't want no part of it. And I said, "You can have it." And I don't know what happened to Bud Smalley, but he never did have no sense. But anyway, I did break him from messing with me. But all right, we were fixing to leave Cape Gloucester, and everybody was raring to get off that mud hole, and we were moved back to the Henderson, no, not Henderson Field. We moved back to the beach, and we were told if we could go up the cargo net on the end of the ship, we could leave. And so I was barefooted at the time. My feet had swollen so I'd pulled my shoes off, and my feet were in terrible shape. But I did make it up that cargo net. And the boy just above me give out, and two sailors came down and got him on up on the ship, and I was able to get on up. But we did get up on that ship, and we went from Cape Gloucester to Pavuvu. Pavuvu was up in the New Georgia group, where a staging area for the next campaign, which was Peleliu. And this was an unusual deal there, and this is where I got sent home. We'd go out every morning, and we'd had to run 5 miles for our breakfast. That was our ticket. And anyway, one morning we came in, and I was standing there reading the bulletin board to seeing what had happened that previous day. And I was reading this order from General George Marshall. And the order was, anyone refusing to take a Jap prisoner would be court-martialed. And anyone that had a portion of the enemy body on his body would be court-martialed. And without knowing anyone was listening, in the matter, I didn't really care. My captain was standing, and this was a new captain. He didn't know me from Adam's house cat, but he was sitting in his tent and he heard me. And I said, what in the hell are they going to come up with next? And he didn't like it. He'd come out and he said, go get your things. You've been over here too long. You developed a bad attitude. And so I took him at his word, and I went and got my things, and I moved out. I had had enough. And so I got to come home, and anyway, they didn't have a ship for me to ride at that time, and so they put me guarding 8 balls. There were people who had trouble getting through the previous battles, and they were a little bit off the rocker, and they were in terrible shape. And I won't guard over them people for about a little more than a week. But I did finally get on the boat and come home. My company went on to Peleliu, and in fact, if I had kept my mouth shut, I would have been up there. It went on to Peleliu, and there was 40-some men killed out of my company on that particular invasion. And my good friend Reb Stockton got killed there. He went out, he replaced me as a scout. He was good, but anyway, he was shot down by one of his own men. There was 40-some men killed out of my company, in that invasion. We're finally getting on that ship to come home. Everything was much prettier than it was going over. We were not being chased or stormy weather or anything like that. The weather was very good, and we got to San Diego, and I never did know how beautiful I thought California was until this trip. It looked a sight better than it did when we were going over. And we landed there, and I need to tell about how they treated us. They had a receiving center in San Diego that had a long table, and they kept it sitting there. I believe it was all day long. And they had everything in the world you could think of on that table, from jackrabbit on, you name it. They had it on that table. And all of us were hungry. And I'd eat that old emergency candy where scouts used, and I'd eaten it till my stomach had contracted to where I couldn't eat very much. And I went and then sat down at that table, and I thought I was going to eat a bowl, but I couldn't eat very much. And I sat there, and that picture that you saw of Uncle Sam pointing his finger, don't bite the hand that feeds you. And seeing that picture didn't help my appetite either. But that was the best food I think I ever put in my mouth, was that receiving center in San Diego where they took us that next day when we got home. And then we got on a train and we rode to Atlanta. We got off that train in Atlanta and got on buses. And we came to, and when we got on that bus, there was a huge woman, and I'd say she weighed 210 pounds at least. And she got right side of my seat, and she'd rock from one foot to the other. And I couldn't stand it no longer, and finally I got up and gave her my seat. And I stood up from Atlanta to Raleigh. And this woman sat in that seat. And when I got to Raleigh, I was exhausted. And anyway, the bus driver that was on that bus, he didn't know much about his job, or I didn't know much about him. But anyway, I told him I'd take care of him if he'd just get off that bus.
Over what?
Over what he said to me. He asked me if I was drunk. And I went to my uncle's where I lived, and when I was going to school, Wake Forest, and my uncle and aunt lived there. And that's where I went when I got home. Went to my home place, which was Newton Grove. That's where I was raised.
How long were you on leave?
I believe I was on leave about 2 weeks, and we left there, and I was transferred to Jekyll and St. Simon's Island in Georgia. When I got down to Georgia, first went to the balloon base, and it was just out of St. Simon. And I don't know why, but mine was transferred to it. And anyway, the next morning, I was taken from that balloon base and carried to St. Simon's. And I was glad they did, because I didn't think that balloons had any place in World War II. But they had them, and I just didn't think they were any good, but that's beside the point. Well, you might say that I had a very enjoyable visit in Georgia at St. Simon's Island. I always wanted to go to Jekyll, but they wouldn't let me. I had to make up the guard, and I sent guys out there all the time, but I couldn't put my name on the roster to go. And anyway, while at St. Simon's Island, we were guarding the radar stations, and up and down the beach, the Germans tried to come in and charge the batteries on their boats. And at one time, the Germans managed to get ashore in Florida. And a bunch of them got caught down there. And anyway, they were taken care of. Now, one place in South Carolina, the Germans got ashore, or threatened to get ashore with their U-boats. And so the Marines were charged with guarding the radar stations, and they had dogs, and those dogs were big dogs, Doberman Pinschers and the like. And those dogs fared better than I did. They got 3 pounds of beef a day, I believe it was. That's enough for anybody. But I didn't get no 3 pounds of beef. But they carried those. They did patrol those beaches from the time I was down there until I left. And so I stayed down there until the Japanese finally surrendered. And in fact, I volunteered to go back to Camp Lejeune to go back in training to go back overseas. And the Japanese surrendered at that time.
What was your job there?
I was still a 731 man, scout.
But what did you do? You worked for your captain there, or major, or somebody. Tell about that.
At St. Simon's.
Yeah.
Well, my job was making up the roster for the boys who went to Jekyll to guard the radars and so on. And just the office work for the Marines.
Okay. How did you come about getting discharged?
Well, at the end of the war, all of a sudden everybody was qualified to be discharged, and so many fellows wanted to re-up and did. But I will never forget what my major said to me. He said, if you will stay with me today, I will make you first sergeant. And I looked at him. I said, Major, you couldn't make me general and keep me. I'm going home. I'm going back to school. And so, I had one man that encouraged me to go back to school the whole time I was in service. And that was the captain who was in World War I. And I can't think of his name right now to save me. But he told me, he said, get yourself back in school. And so it caused me to think, and so that's what I did. I recognize where Robert Louis Stevenson went when he was in the South Pacific. And I also, while I was there, I went on board a ship one day as a pirate. I went aboard, and the captain of the ship was told from a bullhorn on a boat side of the ship, either you let us go aboard or we're going to sink it. Anyway, the captain finally gave us orders to come aboard, and we did get aboard. And after getting aboard getting outside the ship, the fellow in charge of the work party turned around to me and said, can you climb that cargo, can you climb up this rope? And we had a hook on the end of a rope, and we threw it up on the side of the ship. And just as I started up the rope, the man in charge said, they're going to grab you when you get aboard, and they're going to throw you over the other side. Says, just swim around and we'll come around and get you. Well, I began to have the second and third and several other thoughts. But I did climb up. But after I got up there, I couldn't unload or roll a cargo net over the side by myself. But there was one sailor up there. And he saw me struggling with that thing, and he finally came over and gave me a hand. And the two of us rolled the cargo net over the side, and the rest of our crowd went aboard. But what this was all about, the captain, the crew, the people who was aboard ship were Mexicans. And they didn't want to unload the ship. And we needed the supplies on Wallace Island at that time. And so the fellow in charge said, you either unload it, let us unload it, or we're going to sink it. And he showed the captain of the ship where the guns were that were trained on the ship, and he said, we're going to sink it right here. And so he gave us permission to come aboard. So I did play the role of a pirate at that time. This is a little unusual, but I want to tell you one story about my little great-great-grandson. He was born yesterday. Nice-looking young man. 8 3/10 pounds, approximately 21 inches long, and I thought he was an unusual, good-looking boy. His mother and father lived with my wife and I for about 4 years. His grandpa was a good soldier, but I was a good Marine.